In this video, we are going to continue building out our quiz platform, and we're going to focus on the play page. So previously, we built out the quiz listing, which allowed you to hit the database, the Firestore database, and pull every quiz that is in this quizzes collection and list them out here. And each one has its own play button that, if you click on it, will take you to a 404 currently, and it's trying to go to this route, play quiz / and then the ID of our document. So 6F0W, 6F0W. So this is trying to grab this quiz that's about music and load it into the application. So what we need to do today, two pieces. One, we need to figure out how we can get this piece of information from the URL bar. This is called a parameter in React Router. So we will be able to grab that from the URL bar, and then we'll be able to use that to build a custom hook to fetch this quiz from our database. And with those two pieces, we'll be able to basically hook this up to our existing quiz component that had our whole quiz game in there. And so then we will be able to, putting it all together, load any quiz from our database and play through it like we had done with the trivia API previously. I will have starter files linked here. The primary thing that I've changed in these starter files is our previously called quiz folder is now called play quiz, and then I've tweaked some of the components, some small styling and prop changes to just make this pretty seamless in our video here. And then the bigger change is that I added a start screen. So this start screen shows up before the quiz plays, and it displays the description and some details about the quiz before you actually get into the quiz. So it gives a user the chance to preview what the quiz is going to be about before you get into the quiz. And it also, because we have some sound effects in the quiz, gives us a button to assure us that the user has interacted with the page before we get to any of the sound effects, so that we'll be able to actually play those sound effects, because you need to interact with the web page before the audio API is allowed to be used. So if you want to follow along in your project that you've been building along the way, just go to the starter files and grab the play quiz folder and bring it into your application. Or you can alternatively grab all of the starter files and run with it. The changes that I've made here are kind of inconsequential to the actual concepts of getting an ID from React Router and from getting our document from our database. Those are the things I really want to focus on in this video, so I'm not really going to slow down and explain much of the styling small tweaks that have been made in here in the play quiz folder. All right, so if you're working with starter files, just make sure that you have filled in your credentials to the Firebase.js file and you've npm installed in your project. And I believe I have mine running here. Yep, on port 3000. So what I want to do is focus on those two features that we want to build. One, we need to get this ID, and then two, we need to use that ID to grab something from the database. So let's focus on the ID first. And I have the React Router docs pulled up here. And if you're on the web docs and you look at the examples, there's a URL parameters example that explains what we're doing here. So when there are two components here. There's a parent component and then a child component. And the parent component here has a nav and then has a dynamic route. So what's happening here is that the route matches / and then anything that you put after the / it's capturing that as an ID variable. So this is a parameter that then in a child component, so the thing that's being rendered here, we can use the parameters hook to get access to any of those dynamic parameters in the URLs. So as long as we use the same ID here, same case and spelling as we use here, we will have access to that ID. So you can see that if we click on like Netflix, when this child component renders, it's able to pull Netflix from the URL. And all of these links will take us to specific URLs that have that ID filled in. So we can see those there. And we could also type in whatever we want here, and that dynamically matches and that ID is available to us. So this is how we're going to capture the quiz ID from our application. We're going to need to make sure that we have a route with a dynamic parameter, and then in the child component, the thing that's being rendered, we will use the parameters hook to get access to that ID. So where we want to do this in our project is in the app. That's where we were doing our routing before. So this application currently has a route for /quiz, which loads the quiz page. And what I want to do here is make this route play-quiz and then add a parameter at the end for ID. So now if we go to our application, the quiz page will only load if we go to /play-quiz and then put some ID after it. So this refreshed in the background, so we actually are seeing a placeholder component. But if I just like replace this with whatever, we will see the placeholder component loading, that quiz page component loading. Importantly, if you don't have that ID there, that does not match in React Router, so we end up at our 404 page. Okay, so we've made the ID available to us. And if I click on any of these links, we should end up at the to-do with the right ID up here. And now we can focus on bringing that ID into the quiz page component. And actually, before we do that, I see that we still in our nav bar have a quiz link, which doesn't really make sense. There is no singular quiz that this should take you to. So while we're making this next change, let's also remove from the page header our link to /quiz. So now we just have home and quizzes. All right, so this route takes us to the quiz page, and the quiz page is in here. Play quiz page. And here's our little to-do note. So what we can do is bring in the use parameters hook, use params. And this, if I click on this, is going to auto import it from React Router. And what we need to do here, the use params gives us an object, and each of the keys in the object is going to match whatever has been specified in our URL. So back in app. And we can have as many as we want. Like we could have a second ID in here and a third ID. And you can just pull whatever the name of the variable is here in your use params, the return value from your use params. So here we only need one, so I'm going to leave this as /:ID. And then I'm just going to make sure that I type this exactly as I typed it in the dynamic parameter in app. And I should be able to put this on the page now. And if we flip back, we see our quiz ID. This says hot reloaded in the background. Let's try going to a different one, the video game knowledge one, and we see a different ID here, and it should match whatever is in the URL bar. So we've got half of the dynamic quiz built. So we now have the ID available to us, and it is just a matter of us building a custom hook that can pull in that quiz data to put it on the page. We've built custom hooks a couple of times now, so I'm going to show you what my process would be, where I'm just going to immediately start working towards building a custom hook. But if you have trouble starting immediately working in a custom hook, what I recommend is building your logic all in one component here, and then when you have it working, you can refactor it and pull things out into a custom hook. So when I'm thinking about hooks, I want to think about the inputs and the outputs. So what do I need to give to the hook so that it works? And what do I want back from the hook so that I can build my rendering logic here? So let's say that the hook is going to be called use quiz once. So what I want to pass into the quiz is the ID, so the ID of the quiz document. And then what I want back from the quiz is some kind of object that's going to have a few properties. So like with our collections, I'm going to want some kind of status so that I know whether we're in the loading, the error, the success state. I'm going to want back the error if an error exists. And I'm probably going to also want to know the data from the quiz. So this would be the object that has the title, the description, all the questions, and everything else. So that would be this object here. That's the minimum that I probably want. We might add a few more things as we start building the use quiz once, but this is how I would think about building a custom hook. I want to map out what do I need to give it and what do I want back from the hook. And once I figured that out, I can start building the use quiz once hook. And this is going to look incredibly similar to the hook that we have built previously that was in our data folder hooks. We built the use quizzes once, which went to the quizzes collection and got all of the documents. And this was happening in an effect when the hook was mounted. So we put an empty array as the dependency here. So this runs once. And remember with Firebase, with Firestore, there's the possibility of running something once or running it to get real-time updates. So this is a component that just grabs the collection once, and then it returned this object that had some of the information from the Firebase, the Firestore API, but it also had kind of processed things. Like we had made our own, we took the snapshots that we got back and turned it into our own object that was easier to use. And we added in this isEmpty property that's sort of a computed property that our hook is calculating. So we're going to do something similar here. In our hooks folder, we're going to create a new file called use quiz once. And we are going to export default use quiz once. And then this we had said that, let's go ahead and just grab this and copy it over. So we said that it is going to need an ID passed into it. So I'm going to call this quiz ID. And then at the end, it's going to return some kind of status, error, and data. So we're going to have some return at the end that is an object that has those fields filled in. So let's save this. Let's bring this use quiz once in here. And because I have this file loaded, this auto-completed for me as I hit tab, pass in my ID. And instead of destructuring the object, I'm just going to call this quiz. So this will be the object that has the status, the error, the data associated with it. So one thing that can be helpful when you're building your custom hooks is to throw a console log in here. So anytime this component re-renders, which can come from state changes in this hook, we're just going to dump out the return value of quiz. So we should see the status, the error, the data dumped to our console. Right now, we should just see an empty object there if we've made no mistakes. Make sure there's nothing. Yep, no errors, and here's our object, which is just an empty object when we hit the play quiz page. So now we can start building this out. We're going to need to, similar to our use quizzes once, we're going to need to have some kind of state variable. So I'm going to say quiz state set quiz state. And I let React or Visual Studio auto import useState from React for me. And then this is going to be an object that's going to have status of loading, snapshot of null, and error of null as the starting state here. And like with use quizzes once, I'm going to use a flag, a string flag, to indicate the status rather than a Boolean for is loading. The reason why I'm doing that is that eventually we will want this to have at least 4 states. There'll be a loading, success, error, and then for when we actually start editing a quiz, kind of an updating status. So a string is a better representation of that than a bunch of Booleans in separate fields. So that's what we're doing here. We've got status, snapshot, error, and we know that this database logic should happen in a use effect when the component mounts. So setting up a use effect here with an empty array of dependencies so that this effect only runs when our component mounts. And then this logic is asynchronous. So what I want to do is give myself here a getDoc function that is asynchronous that we call inside of our use effect. Remember, we can't make this arrow function that we are saying is our effect asynchronous because that breaks the React API. So what you need to do is create an asynchronous function inside of your use effect. So the logic here is going to look really similar to our use quizzes once, but I think it's useful to pull up the docs to point out where we're pulling the API information from. So I'm back on Cloud Firestore. The guides here get data once, and if I click on get a document, we can see you can specify the collection, then the doc, and then this gives you a object, a reference that you can call get on that returns a promise. So this will resolve successfully and give you a doc snapshot, or this will error and you will end up with a specific error from the Firebase API. And we can also pull up the reference here. And we are using the version 8 of the Firebase API. The next version's in beta, so we're not using that just yet. And then under Firestore here, the document reference was the thing that we call .getOn, which gives us a document, a promise that resolves to a document snapshot. And this is the thing that tells us whether the document exists, its ID, and then it has a method called get, which will give us the data that's in that document. So what we're going to want to do is, in our try, attempt to get the result of saying db.collection quizzes.doc, and we're going to pass in our ID here, get. So this is a reference to a collection. This gives us a reference to a document, and then this gives us the promise that resolves to a doc snapshot. And let's add a catch here in case something goes wrong. And I like to, in development, dump these to my console so that I can see all of the details about the error here. And now we just need to hook this up to our state. So similar to what we did here with the loading success error states, I'm going to do those here in use quiz once. So before we start, set quiz state. And this line that I'm doing here isn't strictly necessary because we've initialized the state to this already, but this helps us remember that when we get to doing real-time updating, when this get kicks off, when we start getting new information, we do need to be mindful of making sure that we actually change the state. Okay, so we get something back. We'll say that this is success, and we will dump the snapshot variable in there. And then if we get an error, we will say that this is error, snapshot is null, and we'll dump the error object in there. So one thing that the linter is complaining about is that in my dependencies, I've not specified that there are any dependencies, but I have used a variable that is from the outer scope here. So to make sure that if the quiz ID changed at some point, whatever was being passed in, that this get runs again, I want to make sure that this is expressed as a dependency. So anytime this changes, we do a new get. And actually, as I'm saying that, that if we use that hook in this way, like we have the ability to be on the same page, but change which quiz we're trying to load, we would definitely need to keep this in there to make sure that we actually display some kind of loading indicator when the fetch is running for a new quiz. Okay, so this alone should give us something running in our component. So let's return some stuff so that we can actually see it printing out. Or actually, you know what? Instead of returning yet, let's because we had our console log here, we'll leave that and we'll get to making sure that things are connected to the play quiz. But let's just dump the state out here. So console log quiz state. So anytime the hook re-renders, we should see this log printing out. So we should hopefully see it go from loading to success or error. So loading, and then we stay in that loading state because we call the set state at the beginning of the fetch, and then we head to the success state, which has no error, but has the snapshot that has the exists property, and then the ID property, and then the data, where is that? The data method here that would, if we call that, give us back the quiz data. So let's start working on returning the information from this state. So I think what we had said before was that we, at minimum, need the status, the error, and the data. And I would like to add a couple more things to this return. So I'd like to add an ID, a Boolean that tells us whether this quiz exists, and then also the processed data. So if we have a snapshot, so if there is some data, and let's actually destructure the quiz state so that we have this in a local variable. So I want the status, the snapshot, and the error from quiz state. Get rid of this console log. So if we have a snapshot, we can start filling in this information. If we don't have a snapshot, then we're in the loading or error state, and we don't have data for sure, and we probably don't know whether it exists because the error could have been a connection error rather than an error with not finding something in the document. In fact, not finding the quiz would not throw an error. So we just need to make sure that when we set up these variables that we only fill them in when we actually have something back from the API. So the ID would be equal to the snapshot.id. The exists is equal to the snapshot.exists property, and the data is the snapshot.data, the result of calling snapshot.data. And these are all coming from the reference here. Our snapshot is a document snapshot. So we have exists ID, we have the data method that we can call on to pull out the information we want. And what we're trying to do is sort of erase the parts of the Firebase API in the return value here. So I don't want my component to have to call a data method. I just want my component to have a basic object of the data returned to it. And the ID here is probably something that's not strictly necessary because we're passing in a quiz ID, but I want to keep all that information together in the return value in case it's useful in future versions of our hook. So let's return the ID, whether or not the document exists, the data, and let's also return the status and error. So now that we're returning an object from our use quiz once hook back on our play quiz page, this console log should start doing something. So we should start seeing the returned value of the hook, and we can make sure that status, error, data are all showing up here. So the first time we're in the loading state, and then our set state when the asynchronous logic kicks off keeps us in the loading state. And then down here, we end up with a successful result from the Firebase API. So we've got our ID, success, it exists, and then here's all the data. The description, the difficulty, the questions, we've got all of the quiz data here. So this looks like it's working. And if we try going to /quiz like 123, so that's not something that is in our document. There's nothing under the ID of 123. We can see where we go loading, and then we have our success state down here. And importantly, this does not throw an error. Firebase is very permissive with what you're allowed to do. So what it returns to you is exists false. So this is how we know we successfully connected to the database, but there is nothing in this ID. So we're going to need to use that when we're displaying things on the page. All right, so I'm going to hit back to make sure that I'm on something that has some successful data here. I've got a valid ID, and we can start filling out the UI. So I'm going to do a similar pattern to what we've done before. Is I want all of the stuff that's on the page to be wrapped in this main element for semantic reasons. And I want to dynamically insert some contents inside of the main element. So when we're in our loading state, we'll do a spinner. When there's an error, we'll display an error. And if there's no quiz, we'll display a different type of error. And then lastly, if we have successful data, we'll put our actual quiz on the page. So all of this will, or the first two branches here will allow us to use the quiz status, or not allow us. We will use the quiz status here to determine what to put on the page. So if we're in loading, then we will put loading spinner on the page. And I have, I guess, already imported this here in the starter files. And if our quiz status is error, we will put an error message on the page that said something went wrong, please try again. So with this, we should, when we go back to this page, see a loading spinner for a split second while the page is connecting. And if we go ahead and try to test the error logic, so if I go back here to, this is the play quiz page, and we go into our quiz once hook, and I change this status to be error, we can see that we got something has gone wrong. Okay, so let's also handle the situation where there was no error, but there is no quiz. So remember, we returned a Boolean to say whether or not it exists. So if we say if it doesn't exist, we can throw a different error message on the page. no quiz found. So if we do that and we go to our 123 quiz, connects successfully and then displays an error message to let the user know, hey, there's nothing here. All right, so I'm going to head back to our valid data, and the last branch of our conditional logic here is if we actually have valid data, we can connect this to our quiz game component. So, whoops, I called it game up here in the import. So this is the modified version of the game component that we had previously. So this game component here accepts a prop of quiz data now, and then it does all of our logic with putting the quiz on the screen. And it importantly has 3 possible screens. So it either has a start screen, an end screen, or it has a trivia item that it's displaying. So as long as we pass it the data from Firebase for the quiz, it will be all set up to run. So I'm going to use that property, quiz data, and what I want to pass in is not the quiz object, which has the status, the exists, the ID. I want just the data property that we created on the return value from our hook. So this is the object of all of the data from here. So created at description, difficulty, etc. So if I give that a save and flip back, loads for a second, and then our quiz description pops up here with some details pulled from the data. So we had stored when it was created and modified, who owned it, the questions, the title, the description. So all of that is just kind of being very loosely formatted here as a start screen before the quiz. And then once you hit play, it takes you into the quiz. And let's get this one wrong. And we end up playing through the whole quiz here with our score and our time to complete. And our best score is still a placeholder there from when we built this previously. Eventually, we'll be able to hook that up to Firebase to store the score. And then if you retry, it takes you back to the start screen. So with this, we should now be able to head back to our quiz listing, and any quiz here that we click on should take us to that description and then let us head into the quiz. So let's try getting a few of these wrong. Coffee beans. And then let's get a few of these right. Compare to variables. And we end up with 2 out of 4 for our score. And we can continue going back through the game here. So we successfully built out the play page that hooks up to our quiz listing page. So remember, on the quiz listing page, this is worth highlighting, we put a bunch of previews onto the screen. So we connected using our hook to the database to get all of the quizzes. And then in our quiz preview, we put all those details, the title, the tags, the owner, the description, and then we created a route here. So we have a link that points to playquiz/ID. So this is what hooks up with our new route that we created here, playquiz/ and then :ID, so that we're able to pull all that information in on our quiz page and actually get that quiz displaying and loading through our components that we've got here. And it's probably worth just a quick glance. The start screen here, this is the new screen that's added to the game. This pulls in a bunch of the information from the quiz data and displays it in a formatted way on the screen. And it's also very defensive. It makes sure that if there is some missing data from our Firebase or our Firestore database, that we fill it in with some placeholder information. So for now, this is a good thing to do. Defensive coding can be a good thing to do with a NoSQL database. When we get to editing and submitting data to our database, we can kind of be assured that some of these fields are actually in the database, but it's not a bad idea for us to do this anyway. One other thing that I've modified here is making sure that the player, if there are no questions in the quiz, make sure that the player can't actually try to play the quiz. So we get locked out on the details page. So if I were to come back and add a blank quiz, and go into my application, refresh my quiz listing, and go try to play this, we end up with a blank quiz, and you can't play this. It has no questions yet, 0 questions. And this button is disabled. So there's a bit of the defensive coding going on in our quiz component now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that document here. All right, wrapping up, we learned about dynamic routes that have parameters with React Router, and then we made our custom hook that was able to pull some data from our API and feed it into our existing quiz components that we had built. Next up, we are going to look at how to build some custom hooks that talk to our database and give us ways to update that data that's in the database. So what we want to do to kind of fill out the platform is give the user the ability to, within our web application, make some quizzes. So that means we're going to be able to both create and edit quizzes. And that will require us to build a new route in the application that loads some data and exposes some ways for us to mutate or change that data in Firestore. So that's what's coming up next.